for today. Our first speaker is Sarah Hendricks, and she is a senior researcher here at the Center for Urban Transportation Research. She has worked in the field of transportation demand management for 18 years, and Sarah has a particular interest in research that promotes the development of alternative transportation, and that includes bicycling, walking, and public transportation. Our second presenter is Marianne Coos. Marianne is a special projects coordinator with the Florida Department of Transportation, and her emphasis is on bicycling and walking. Much of Marianne's work involves improving Florida's criteria for how cyclists and pedestrians are accommodated. She also works on researching new techniques or materials which can improve safety, writing department policy, and providing technical assistance and training. So with that, I'd like to turn the time over first to Marianne.
Thank you very much. This is Marianne Coos, and it was really exciting to see how many of you on the webinar are actually your first exposure to the CUTR webinars. And what's interesting is that we found that there's a great interest in Florida and around the country in looking at how to better provide for multimodal transportation, and shared bike and bus lanes could be one of those tools, but there was very little evaluation or consensus in the criteria. So that this research effort was really to first look for best practices out there in existing bike and bus lanes, and then to think about what we would need to learn more about these facilities so that we could begin to provide guidance in how to best design them. And I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. So this was an exploratory study to find out what's out there. This was a project that was funded by the National Center for Transit Research, and I also worked on this project with Principal Investigator Dr. Edward Hilsman and Joanne Phoebe, who was a graduate student assistant at the time. So there are no national standards that we found out there for shared bike bus lanes, and throughout this presentation I used the abbreviation SBBL to stand for shared bike bus lane. So we decided to use a working definition of shared bike bus lane based upon what we found out there. So our definition is a traffic lane dedicated for exclusive use by buses, bicycles, and usually by right-turning vehicles. And sometimes taxis and delivery vehicles are permitted to stop. And in this slide you see out of the Streetscape Design Manual of the City of Panama City Beach a concept for a planned facility shared bike tram lane. And so local governments want to find low-cost ways to improve the desirability to use public transit and to bicycle without road widening. We found that shared bike bus lanes are less common in the United States than in the United Kingdom. The UK has extensive bus lane networks in many of their towns and cities, and bikes are allowed to use the bus lanes. There are other countries that have them, including France, Denmark, Ireland, Australia, Canada, and several others. We found that shared bike bus lanes function in different settings. For example, central business districts, suburban areas, university towns, and oftentimes towns with tourist attractions. We looked for studies, research that have evaluated shared bike bus lanes, and we found very few that have evaluated their safety and effectiveness. And then lastly, transit agencies tend to be brought in after the fact with regards to planning the shared bike bus lanes. They tend to be more in a reactive mode. So our presentation objectives here are to share some findings on what available guidance is out there in the United States and in municipalities, talk about some general characteristics of existing shared bike bus lanes, share 4 case study examples, and these are from Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Ocean City, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Talk about some key considerations for shared bike bus lane design and operation, and then talk about some recommendations for further research. So with regard to state guidance, we really did not find a whole lot out there. Here's 4 examples, but generally the guidelines give maybe a sentence or two. They may specify minimum width for a shared bike bus lane, perhaps have a general statement with regard to the process of developing shared bike bus lane. Washington State alludes to conditions when a shared bike bus lane might be appropriate. Here it says, where bus speeds and volumes are low, but there's no specification with regard to those threshold values for what low speed and low volume is. Municipal guidance is also available in a few places and provides a little bit more detail, tends to specify minimum and preferred lane widths, may specify conditions where appropriate. In more than one place we found a statement that was something like, shared bike bus lanes should be implemented only where insufficient width for separate bike lane and separate bus lane is available. We found 27 examples of existing shared bike bus lanes in the U.S. that conformed to our working definition of what a shared bike bus lane is. And we also found a number of others that didn't quite conform to our definition. We found a few that are in the planning stages, one that used to exist and then was removed. The earliest still in use is located on Coastal Highway, which is State Route Maryland, State Route 528 in Ocean City, Maryland, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. Half of the shared bike bus lanes were established in the last 10 years. Two of the locations have colored pavement for their shared bike bus lanes, and in the photo here you see Chestnut Street, Philadelphia. 18 out of the 27 shared bike bus lanes operate on lane width of 13 feet or less, and the speed ranges for these facilities were between 20 and 45 miles an hour. We found two locations where during the off-peak travel periods, the shared bike bus lanes allow on-street parking. That's in Seattle and Denver. In our study, we wanted to determine if we could make any kind of generalizations about the facilities out there, given that there are no national standards. And we categorized what we found into three general types of shared bike bus lane facilities, categorized by length, setting, and function. And the first type you see here represents short connector segments. These tend to connect bike lane segments, perhaps across a bridge or overpass or through an intersection. They tend to be less than a half-mile long. And here is 9th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. As an example of that. Secondly, our urban shared bike bus lanes that connect to downtowns tend to be less than 2 miles long. They often experience large swings in traffic volumes. In this example, this is Elliott Avenue, west in Seattle. It connects a suburb to the central business district, and this one becomes a parking lane during the off-peak. A third type might be classified as a suburban shared bike bus lane, tend to be found along busy arterials and state highways, tend to be greater than 2 miles, operate at higher speeds than the urban shared bike bus lane, so that would be about 35 miles per hour and higher. This is Coastal Highway. It's an example, and also the subject of one of the case studies that I'm going to talk about next. So there are 4 examples that I'd like to share that provide a little bit more detail, and they represent a variety of types of shared bike bus lanes in different contexts under different operating conditions. All 4 of the examples operate within constrained right-of-way, and they all allow right-turning vehicles. So this first one is Maryland, State Route 528, Coastal Highway in Ocean City, Maryland. It's a beach community with an active tourist industry. Until the late 80s, they had dedicated bus lanes, but then bicyclists started using the lanes, and so the Maryland State Highway Administration added signage officially allowing bicycles to use lanes, and more recently they added bike route signs to designate these facilities as part of a larger bike route network. It's 7.5 miles long with a brief interruption of 5 blocks on a northbound shared bike bus lane where there's insufficient width at the entrance to the Ocean City Expressway. So this city is about a little bit more than 7,000 people in the winter, but then it balloons to over 300,000 people in the summer season. They have special events, lots of traffic congestion, and then, of course, illegal users that want to use this lane capacity. It's an 8-lane divided highway. There's 3 general purpose lanes in each direction with a combined shared bike bus right turn lane adjacent to both curbs. This facility has curb and gutter, and there are sidewalks that are directly adjacent to the shared bike bus lane that are between 4 and 6 feet wide. And here's a few more details. Buses run year-round in this town, 24 hours a day. In addition to the right turn vehicles, also they allow scooters and scoot coupes, which are the 3-wheel vehicles. By Maryland state law, these types of vehicles must operate less than 30 miles per hour. This facility also experiences pedestrians, other illegal users. Pedestrians tend to walk out into the lane because the sidewalk is right there. There's also a lot of joggers and rollerbladers. A second example is in Washington, D.C., 7th Street and 9th Street Northwest. They operate as a pair. 7th Street goes northbound, 9th Street goes southbound. Heavy commuter traffic, and in addition to that, by virtue of its location, lots of visitor, tourist traffic, and of course the visitors and tourists, they don't know where they're going, so that compounds the congestion. In 2003, 7th and 9th Streets were redesigned for a new bus circulator, and then they allowed bikes to use this facility. 9th Street switches every other block using 2 different types of configurations. The first type, every other block, it's one way, shown here, with 2 general traffic lanes, southbound, separate bike lane, separate bus lane, and 1 parking lane. And here you can see enforcement is a problem. The cars in the bus-only lane. And then the alternating blocks, it shifts to 2-way traffic, 1 general traffic lane in each direction, and a southbound combination shared bike bus right turn lane with parking on both sides. And 7th Street Northwest is also this same configuration, only going northbound. There's a high demand for street space, as you can see here. In addition to the bus circulator, there's many other bus routes that use this facility. They have lane markings at the beginning, midpoint, and end of most blocks along this. Wide white solid lines become dashed where there are conflict zones. And here's a few more details. General consensus amongst staff of the district, DOT, and also Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority and bicycle organizations in that area agree that the lanes, the shared bike bus lanes, don't function very well, and it's primarily due to so many illegal users on the lane. A third example is a 9-block stretch of Hennepin Avenue in downtown Minneapolis. Between 1994 and 2009, it operated, as you see in the right-hand photo, 3 general traffic lanes one way with a contraflow bus lane and a 2-way bike lane in between. As part of a plan to improve downtown circulation and access, in 2009, Hennepin Avenue was converted to 2-way operation with combined shared bike bus right turn lanes on both sides. And on the left side of this illustration, you see what it used to look like, and then in the center and right figures of this illustration is what it looks like now. Every other block there's left turn lanes, and on those blocks with the left turn lanes, the shared bike bus lane is 13.5 feet wide, and then on the blocks where there are no left turn lanes, it widens to 18.5 feet wide. Public Works Department in Minneapolis evaluated the streets before and after the 2-way conversion, and what they found was that general traffic remained constant at about 20,000 vehicles per day, but there was also an increase in cross-street traffic. With regard to bike traffic, they measured a decrease from 1,190 to 990 bicycles per day. But also during this two-way conversion process, there had been some other changes, design changes that had been made to adjacent streets. So it's a little bit hard to draw clear conclusions about the impact of the shared bike bus lanes. They did find area-wide bike counts showed that overall there was an increase in bicycle traffic by about 43% in the immediate area. Public Works in Minneapolis received a number of complaints from bicyclists about the shared bike bus lanes after they had been installed. The complaints had to do with the pavement markings not being visible enough, the many illegal users, the thought that perhaps the shared lane markings in the lanes might be part of the cause of motorist confusion, and so motorists tended to use the lanes illegally. So FHWA granted approval to Minneapolis to experiment with 4-foot wide green painted lanes, and the green paint extended 3.5 feet away from the curb. The paint does not extend into the intersection, and then they also enlarged the pavement markings. And so Public Works did a follow-up study to see what the effect of the green pavement was on lane position of the lane users, and they found that with regard to bicyclists, in those blocks where it was 13.5 feet wide, the shared bike bus lane, 80% of the bicyclists rode within the green pavement area. But where the shared bike bus lane widened to 18.5 feet wide, it increased to 93% of the bicyclists riding within the green pavement. In the narrower blocks at 13.5 feet, both motorists and buses tended to ride farther into the green pavement area. Also, bus operators rode farther into the green pavement area when they were approaching bus stops, which makes sense. And they also found that both buses and motorists tended to ride farther into the green pavement as they were approaching intersections. Here's a fourth example, Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. It used to be a two-way busway, but businesses in that area had been complaining about noise and diesel fumes driving away business. And so they converted Chestnut Street to a one-way eastbound with, as you see here, one parking lane, a general traffic lane, and then one shared bike bus, combination shared bike bus right turn lane. Now, Walnut Street to the south operates westbound and has a separate bike lane. Chestnut Street was our example that had the narrowest shared bike bus lane at 9 feet wide. This street has high traffic volumes. There's a lot of retail in the area, so there's a lot of delivery trucks. There's 3 universities in the area. Originally, right turns had been prohibited to use the shared bike bus lane, but the public complained, and so that prohibition had been lifted. There's lots of pedestrian traffic in the area, high volumes of pedestrians, and as a result, the motorists, the right-turning motorists, yield to the pedestrians, and that tends to stop traffic in the shared bike bus lane. The Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission partnered with SEPTA and PennDOT to do a study about interactions between bicyclists and buses. And this study was actually done on Walnut Street that has the separate bike lane, but we felt that the observations that they made about bike-bus interaction would likely also apply to shared bike bus lanes as well. The top photo that you see there shows the bicyclist preparing to pass a bus to the left, and doing so requires finding a sufficient gap in traffic to safely pass the bus this way. The bottom photograph shows a common problem where bicyclists are trying to pass on the right, and bus operators are trained to pull over as far to the curb as possible to prevent this, but oftentimes bicyclists still attempt to pass the bus on the right side. And so this is a problem that we find everywhere there are shared bike bus lanes. Some shared bike bus lane designs try to discourage bicyclists from passing between the bus and the curb. And in this photograph, this is from Australia, where people drive on the left side. And so in this photograph, the traffic is coming toward us. Here you see pavement markings that communicate to the bicyclists not to enter past the yellow line when there's a stopped bus. So that's one potential design In addition to the bicyclists passing stop buses between bus and curb, there were two other main problems cited by all these different examples. One was enforcement of the shared bike bus lane, exclusive use, as well as large volumes of right-turning vehicles in the shared bike bus lanes. Determining safe operating speed is another big topic of interest relative to lane width. And in this table, we share a number of examples of comparative posted speed limits on shared bike bus lanes. Now, one would expect wider width with higher speeds, but what we actually found were examples of wide width shared bike bus lane operating at lower speeds, as well as other facilities that operated with a narrow width but operating at higher speed. And then we found everything in between those two extremes. Another consideration regarding motor vehicle speed and width is the bicyclist getting caught in the draft of heavy vehicles, including buses. And so the force increases closer the bus is to the bicycle and the faster that the bus goes. And so this might be a consideration that would be an issue for shared bike bus lanes on perhaps arterials where there are higher speeds. Lane width is another big topic of interest, and this table summarizes lane width recommendations from different sources as compared to actual widths that we have found, and the actual widths are shown in the bottom two rows of the table. And this information is in greater detail in the final report. Now, the recommendations vary according to a number of assumptions. For example, minimum width versus preferred recommended width, whether there's curb and gutter. Also, does one assume passing the bus or the bicyclist as you're passing? Do you stay within the shared bike bus lane while passing? Here's a narrow width bicycle bus lane. So to pass, one must enter into the adjacent lane. This is one of four conceptual bus stop treatments that we developed to try to describe what kinds of scenarios might likely be out there encountered. And it shows conflict points and various design considerations. It's important to note here that this and the other bus stop treatments that I show here, they do not reflect any official guidance or standards. They're not in the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. These are simply descriptions of potential scenarios based on available lane width. And so this first one, this narrow width shared bike bus lane, shows red X's where there are points of potential conflict between bicyclists and other road users, where the shared bike bus lane is too narrow to maintain a 3-foot clearance while passing, and that's, by the way, state law in Florida, as well as 19 other states, where buses and motor vehicles must maintain a 3-foot separation when passing a bicyclist. So the option is to move left into the general traffic lane. And that depends on, being able to do that depends on sufficient gaps and if the traffic is moving slowly enough. And here you see a bus entering into the adjacent travel lane to pass a bicyclist. Here's another view of a narrow width shared bike bus lane. Also includes an advisory cycle lane. And again, this is not in the MUTCD. It's not in official guidance or standards in the United States, but this is something that's used in the United Kingdom. You see there's a stop bar where the bicyclist is expected to stop when a bus is stopped at a bus stop. It also serves, the advisory cycle lane, it serves to guide bus operators to give sufficient lateral clearance when passing a bicyclist. A second option is a wide width shared bike bus lane. It eliminates a conflict point. It can pass, the bicyclist can pass within the lane. And this is something of a luxury because shared bike bus lanes tend to be, the design tends to be considered only where there's a lack of space. But we did find a few examples of wide width shared bike bus lanes. Now, how much lane width is needed to accommodate safe passing while in the lane? So we decided to do an exercise to get some idea of this. And so this diagram illustrates what the necessary width requirements would be under conditions where there is curb and gutter. Operating speeds of buses are 30 miles per hour or less. Lateral clearance of at least 3 feet between a bike and a passing motor vehicle, and sufficient width for a public transit bus of standard width, and that's 8 feet 6 inches in the United States, to pass a bicyclist while staying within the shared bike bus lane. And this width includes 3 feet 4 inches of width of the bicyclist operating space. It's measured from the longitudinal joint of the gutter pan. There's another 3 feet measured from the edge of the bicyclist operating space to the bus body, and that's added per requirements of Florida state law. And then an additional 8 feet 6 inches represents the width of a standard public transit bus. There's an additional width of 1 foot 9 inches. It's added, measured from the left edge of the bus to the middle of the 8-inch wide solid white stripe that separates the shared bike bus lane from the adjacent general traffic lane. And this additional width, it was computed by assuming that the bus is centered in the lane. So positioning the bus in the center of a 12 feet of operating space, and that's the recommended width of a lane for public transit buses. So the 4 widths, and you see in the diagram, A plus B plus C plus D, it totals 16 feet 7 inches when you add those all together. And this is not much less than if you have like a separate 5-foot bike lane and a 12-foot standard lane for buses. So this was just an exercise to kind of see, you know, what kind of space might be required for safe passing. This would require some more research. A third option is a narrow width shared bike bus lane with partial bus bay and advisory cycle lane along the left side. So you have additional feet of width at the curb side for the bus to pull over. And here again, you know, one of the reasons why shared bike bus lanes are considered oftentimes is because there's a lack of space. This option would require some additional space. A fourth option is to create a separate channel for the bicyclist to steer to the right of the bus stop. And this creates a new conflict with pedestrians trying to get to walk across that to get to the bus stop. But this is used in England, as you can see in this photograph. One issue that is commonly cited as an anticipated problem of shared bike bus lanes is leapfrogging, where the bus and the bike repeatedly pass each other. And here you see a quote from the bike ped coordinator from Baltimore, Nate Evans. He said that the leapfrogging concept is overrated. Cyclists typically pass buses and leave them in their wake. I suspect that this may be the case in urban settings, downtowns where buses stop at every block and never really pick up speed. It might be more of an issue in suburban shared bike bus lanes. Here's just a few pointers for bus operator training. Because facilities design can't do all of this, we found no specific training for bus operators specific to shared bike bus lanes, but we found several examples of bus operator training regarding interacting with bicycles in general. And this is a synthesis of several sources. You know, for example, giving sufficient lateral clearance, following at a safe distance, trying to anticipate what bicyclists might do. This is an example of public information for motorists and bicyclists. This is from Minneapolis. This is an excerpt from a brochure that they had broadcast. And that leads us to some ideas for further research. Marianne, did you want to talk about this?
Yeah, we can mention a few of these things. As we were working through this project, what we really learned is that those bike bus lanes that have been implemented, there's been very little actually analytical data collected on how well they're performing. And so part of our research effort was to summarize the things that we felt we needed to have more information on. And these are, the first one is just the effect of how shared bike bus lanes encourage bicyclists to use a corridor, or are they attracted to the corridor for reasons that we might not be aware of, and does the implementation of the shared bike bus lane actually increase the number of cyclists who might be using that route, or in fact do they leave? Since we have no data on how many people actually are using them before and after implementation, we can't say how well they're performing. And then the next thing is that we identified that there needs to be some better ways to collect bicycle traffic count data. For the buses, we could look at the bus schedules and figure out how frequently a bus would be traveling the corridor. But again, we really don't know whether or not these facilities actually encourage or discourage bicycling. And then mobility impacts of the shared bike bus lane upon all modes. We know almost nothing about how pedestrians actually feel about this type of design, and we don't have any objective data. Most of what we would have would be a user's view of how well the facility works. Maryland has done a little bit of work to analyze frequency of crashes in shared bike bus lanes, and found actually in the section that is the shared bike bus lane on Ocean Boulevard that there were quite a few bike and bus crashes. And so we think an important thing to do would be to look at these corridors and to see if we couldn't get data from more of the case studies that might let us be able to look at how successful they are from a safety perspective. And then for the evaluation of alternative bus stop treatments that Sarah showed, again, that one picture maybe that you noticed, it was the two horizontal frames and the passenger was stepping off the bus into the bike lane. So that would be something yet where we know that we need to try to design to prevent that type of a collision where overtaking bicyclists and pedestrian entering or exit the bus do not cross paths, but we don't yet have good data on what techniques might be most successful. Although I see some things like in the it's in the Alexandria King Street Metro Station in Washington, D.C. They kind of have a very nice way of kind of separating out some of the bus and bicycle and pedestrian and driver interactions, and hopefully we can look at that more and learn what they're doing. And then, although the leapfrogging was not considered to be significant, we do realize that a bicyclist is very small relative to a bus, and so one of the ways, to mitigate that difference is to try to have them operating at relatively the same speed so that they pass each other less. And so, what would be a good safe speed for transit vehicles to operate, and at what point does managing the speed diminish the opportunity for that transit vehicle to have its own dedicated lane? So then the characteristics of the gaps in traffic that are necessary to provide safe passing opportunities. We found in other research that we've been doing about how drivers interact with bicyclists in traffic in roadways that don't have bike lanes, that as long as there was sufficient gaps in traffic for drivers to easily move left to overtake the bicyclist and then move, and they usually do a half shift, one wheel stays in their original lane, that seems to work fairly well, and everybody seems to be happy and content with each other. But we don't yet, but a bus is so much larger, and so it's going to require a much larger gap to overtake that cyclist. And then, of course, the whole concept of the bicyclist actually moving out into the adjacent lane, you know, and how drivers are going to respond to that bicyclist who is no longer in the curbside lane. So that's something that finding what those characteristics of the gaps are is an important objective. And then the final way was what are effective ways to enforce the shared bike bus lane restrictions. And you know, what the goal is to design facilities so that people naturally use them correctly, and not designing facilities that create an undue burden on law enforcement to ensure that they're used well. And so there's some different strategies out there about how to enforce who uses these lanes, and those would need to be evaluated to make sure that the use is as it was designed for. So those were the big things that we identified as issues that we need more knowledge on, you know, in learning about how to design shared bike and bus lanes that operate well. And I think and I think, Sarah, we have one more slide, right?
Yeah, just a closing slide of Paris, France, of the many cities out there that might have shared bike bus lanes. Paris is an example, I think the only example where not only do they allow cyclists in the bus lanes, but they encourage bicyclists to use the shared bike bus lanes. So here are two links to the final report that had been completed. The first link is to the Florida Department of Transportation website, and the second is to the website for the National Center for Transit Research.
And one thing I think that both Sarah and I from Florida DOT and from CUTR appreciate so much is the photos that people shared with us to be included in the report and to be included in the presentation, because there's such variety, and being able to see all the different ways that these facilities are designed just helps us so much in learning about them. And also all the communities who shared their information with CUTR as they were collecting the information on the case studies and the facilities that are out there. And I hope some of you are listening in to see how we've presented your particular shared bike bus lane. But one of the things that we learned is that this really had never been done before, to create such a broad summary, and it took all of our partners' time to contribute this information, and just how much we appreciate it. And I think now we might have some time for some questions.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that presentation, Sarah and Marianne. I'll go ahead and reload the instructions on how to ask a question. But we do have a couple that have already come in, so we'll get started with those. Let's see, this one's a little bit long, but I'll go ahead and read it. It says, a lot of people get concerned about buses and bikes sharing a narrow reserved lane. Often these are conversions of existing general traffic lanes. A 10 to 12 bus bike lane is surely much safer for cyclists than the former mixed-use lane was, where bikes are sharing the lane with hundreds of trucks and cars per hour, as well as perhaps a dozen or two buses per hour. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Well, there had been a study from Transport Research Laboratory in 2004 where they gathered information with regard to among other things, they gathered information about bicyclists' perceptions of safety in a shared bike bus lane, and found that bicyclists did appreciate having that additional separation that the shared bike bus lane provided. Although the study really didn't provide any information with regard to actual safety, but it certainly lended some additional comfort and perception of safety on the part of bicyclists by providing that additional separation from the general traffic.
And there is some information, some good research coming, especially out of California, that is looking at what is the type of environment that people who maybe would like to cycle but are a little concerned about how they're going to mix with traffic, about some of the things that they would prefer to have, and less exposure to large volumes of traffic is something that people are interested in. So it kind of makes sense that if you can dedicate a lane and you can reduce the number of vehicles that might be using that space, that bicyclists might actually feel better, safer about riding in that lane. But it gets back to, you know, that identification of further information that we need, that we don't have really great counts of bicycle activity in these facilities, so it's hard to determine what the relative safety is of the facility in actual numbers.
Thank you. Another question that's come in, shouldn't we also consider the network and if there are alternative parallel routes when considering SBBL implementation?
Sarah, do you want to talk about the Maryland project? Because didn't they create an alternative corridor?
You mean the Ocean City?
Yeah.
Actually, no. That shared bike bus lane, Coastal Highway, is the only only north-south street. So that's an example where the bicyclist really has no other choice.
There was no choice. Okay.
No choice at all. But certainly that's a good point. That if there are parallel streets with less traffic, I mean, that would be a much better alternative for bicyclists.
And it wasn't one of our case studies because it hadn't been built at the time, but Hillsborough, I think it's called Avenue in Raleigh, North Carolina. They have this east-west road that borders the campus on the north side, and it's a very high transit corridor and pedestrian corridor. And when they were looking at studying how to improve Hillsborough Street, I think it's Hillsborough Street, they also planned for a parallel street just to the north that was more of a low volume street that could be used by bicyclists that preferred to have kind of a less intensive mix of traffic. So I think giving people choices, especially because bicyclists are so diverse in their abilities and their preferences as far as where they would like to ride. So giving people choices is a really smart move.
We've received a question about the presentation slides, so I'd just like to make that announcement and remind anyone who missed it that those are in the handouts center, upper right-hand corner. The icon looks like 3 sheets of paper. When you click on that icon, you'll see several documents that are available for download today, so that's just a reminder. But we do have some other questions that have come in, so I'll go ahead and proceed with those. Many cities seemed to have implemented SBBL shared bus bike lanes just because cyclists have used them no matter what. Seems like Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary allow bicycles on their, quote, bus lanes, unquote, but it seems that there's only a bike pictogram added by default because cyclists will use them anyway. Any other U.S. cities seem to have the same pattern, is the question.
Well, the Ocean City example was like that, where they started out with dedicated bus lanes, and the bicyclists were using it. And I think that one of the reasons why they decided to make it official as a shared bike bus lane was because there really was no other place for the bicyclists to ride. And certainly riding on the sidewalk, the narrow 4 to 6 foot sidewalk, and attempting to share that with large numbers of pedestrians would be very dangerous. So I think in some cases they look at the alternatives and decide that perhaps the bicyclists are safest within the bus lane, particularly if there isn't enough space to provide for a separate bicycle lane.
And it might be somewhat too is that historically maybe we haven't really thought about purposefully accommodating bicyclists, and there's been a resurgence in bicycling in the country, and so bicyclists are cycling is becoming more popular, especially in dense urban environments like, the Chestnut Street project and the 7th and 9th Street projects in D.C. They're working really hard on promoting bicycling, and so you have this new group of travelers that need a space, and that outside lane is the space on the roadway where they traditionally are.
Next question. Excuse me. Have you studied the impact of bus stop location? The example is far end versus near end, after the intersection versus before the intersection, on the performance of the shared bike bus lanes.
This study did not look at that particular question, no.
Okay.
And I think too is just that we're learning from a pedestrian perspective that it's better to have the bus stop in a location where if the pedestrian needs to cross to the other side of the street, that they're visible to approaching drivers. So I think that and when you're thinking about performance, I guess you're thinking maybe about efficiency of operation, but it's also one of those areas where we would want to look at the safety of the people who are using transit itself, and how to best encourage them as to where to cross. So, but that, again, like Sarah said, wasn't part of this study.
Great, thank you. Our next question from the audience is, I understand the calculations for a minimum width of shared lane, but if you have a space for a 16.5-foot lane, why wouldn't you just provide an 11.5-foot bus lane and a 5-foot bike lane instead?
Well, that is actually one of the things that, as we were calculating this space, we thought of. And I grew up and went to school in Wisconsin, in Madison, and they have that bicycle bus configuration on University Avenue. And several of us were talking about that last week, about how that it works pretty well. And part of that is because there is a lot of bicyclists, and so definitely there was the volume of bicycle activity to warrant that allocation of space. But it's a good idea, and it's something that's very much on the table, is when you have that kind of space. But if you remember, what Sarah mentioned is most of these configurations actually are occurring within existing roadways, and we're looking at how to reallocate the space that we currently have. And the Madison example actually that was part of a major reconstruction project of University Avenue, and so they had an opportunity to actually make some differences in the amount of space they had to work with.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how do you get input from all of the cycling communities? The hardcore riders tend to be very vocal, but often the casual or timid riders are overlooked. That is, children riding to school or families, and those who cannot, or excuse me, those who ride because they cannot drive.
Well, that's a really good point. As Marianne had mentioned before, we've got bicyclists of widely ranging skills and preferences, in addition to a lot of people that they would like to ride if they felt comfortable but don't ride. That latent bicycle demand. So that's a good question. I mean, I think that it's important to try to figure out ways to capture the viewpoints of people who are interested in riding but currently don't, as well as other populations, like children.
And too, we realize that bicyclists and pedestrians come with this enormous breadth of ability and preferences. And so while there is, some groups that are more vocal, and in fact it's always interesting that when we're talking to communities about improving the bicycle and pedestrian environment, the bicyclists are always at the table, but the pedestrians much less so. And so we're always aware of the fact that although we're hearing from some people, we're probably not hearing from everyone, and that we always need to take into consideration, all the preferences of the people we're serving. The elderly, children. If you think about DOT's design criteria, like in our urban environment, we have that bike lane, a regular bike lane, so that those cyclists who are traveling faster and have traffic skills, can ride in the street and get off of the sidewalk. But if you're a child or if you're a person who doesn't have traffic skills, there's always the option of, using the sidewalk. So it's all about giving people choices and recognizing the breadth of ability and preferences.
And I guess with a study like that, if you wanted to capture all of the potential bicyclists as well as pedestrians, if there were the funds for such a study, certainly a survey of the general population, also perhaps, conducting focus groups that wouldn't, be a good representation of what the general population thought, but, focus groups of elderly or focus groups, including younger people or different types of groups, might be able to capture the range of concerns and interests with regard to bicycle facilities.
Thank you. Two more questions. In looking at conversion of existing lanes for use as dual bike transit lanes, other than width and right-of-way, what other things should be considered in a feasibility study?
Well, probably the biggest issues that municipalities have grappled with and have recognized, would be, what are the volumes of, the numbers of bicyclists currently using the facility or wanting to use the facility, number of buses, bus headways, volumes of right-turning vehicles, what the volumes of the general traffic is on the adjacent lane, in addition to the operating speed of the bus lane as well as the general traffic lane. Those are a few of, I guess, the biggest ones.
Yeah, and I think we might also add in there the frequency of bicycle activity and the opportunity for the bicyclists to safely overtake the buses, and how, too, is how can we design the transit stop itself so that there's a sufficient capacity to accommodate the volume of pedestrians who might want to be using the transit services. And I think, too, the frequency of driveways is important, too.
Yeah, I guess also just fluctuations in traffic volume. If there's heavy commuter traffic and perhaps off-peak periods where there isn't as much traffic. I know there were a few locations that operated shared bike bus lane facilities only during the off-peak. So that's another consideration where there could potentially be a shared bike bus lane just during certain parts of the day. Now that kind of introduces, other enforcement problems and education problems with regard to the proper use of that. But, that's another alternative that has been tried.
Sarah and Marianne, what type of pavement markings are recommended to meet MUTCD standards for separating the general lanes from the shared bus bike lane and legally allow for right-turning vehicles?
Well, the MUTCD actually has a pretty good chapter on this. I believe it's part 3D, and it's the preferential lane markings. There's also a part, I guess it's 2 something, but preferential signage. So a designer would want to make sure they look in the MUTCD, and then apply those guidelines for signage and pavement markings. One of the things, if you go back to the little diagram we had about how much space would we need to create a shared bike bus lane from scratch that included all of the criteria for operating space and minimal passing distance and things like that. And there's several schematics in there related to the lane that would separate the shared bike bus lane from the general travel lane in the MUTCD. And there's requirements about the width of that line. Some of the scenarios actually have a double line, but it's important for a designer to make sure they look in the MUTCD. And the volume we were checking in is, there's the 2009 MUTCD is kind of the accepted current edition, but make sure you're looking in the version that includes the 2012 updates, okay? So it'll be branded as 2009, but there'll be a little link and you'll see includes the 2012 updates, and you'll want to use those.
Great, thank you. We have reached the 1 hour mark, but we do have one final question. So this will be our last question, and I'll go ahead and read you this one. In Tucson, shared bus bike lanes are used on Broadway Boulevard, which is a 4 to 6 lane arterial. One problem is at congested intersections, vehicles use the shared lane to queue up for right turns, so the cyclists must merge into the vehicular travel lane. Do you know of any other communities that have come up with other strategies to address this problem?
No. Sarah, did you find any?
No, I haven't. I know, like in the NACTO guide, there were some design concepts for a right turn lane where space is allocated on the left side of the right turn lane for bicyclists to queue. But that's a problem. I mean, with large volumes of right turning vehicles, where should the bicyclists be? I mean, that's a big issue.
Right. And in our own design criteria, we very much, our goal is to, when we have the spaces, to get every traveler in the right position at the intersection. And especially, we want to discourage bicyclists from being on the right-hand side of right-turning traffic, especially large vehicles. And so I really, Tucson, is a wonderful city for bicycling. And I really appreciate that the drivers there are the drivers are aware, but the bicyclists also are aware, and they realize that when it's a single lane without the division of space, with the keyhole lane or the little space for the little lane for the bicyclist to the left of the right turn lane, that they're all queuing in that lane, hopefully one behind the other, and not risking being trapped by the right turning vehicle at the curb. That's a great space for the bicyclist just to move into the travel lane and to queue and wait for their turn to pass through that intersection. So.
Great, thank you. Well, that's the end of our questions, and we've reached the end of our webcast. I'd like to thank Sarah Hendricks and Marianne Coos both for presenting today, and I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and their engagement by asking lots of great questions. Just a quick reminder that our next webcast is 2 weeks from today, October 4th, and the topic is practices to protect bus operators from passenger assaults. So we hope you'll join us for that webcast and others in the future. We have applied for AICP credit for today's webcast, so please complete this evaluation, and we'd like your feedback, whether you're seeking credit or not. So please let us know your thoughts and suggestions for future webcasts. So with that, once again, thank you for attending, and I hope you all have a productive afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.